Hey friends, welcome back. Most of you know that I mostly do webflow tutorial videos on this channel, but from time to time I've done videos that are more focused on design, and this is going to be one of them. The inspiration from this video came from proof of concepts that I've been doing at work recently, so I want to expand on that a little bit more. I work as a creative director for an agency called Whiteboard, and as part of our overall design process, our first design deliverable is always the creative direction. So essentially we want to align with the client on what the website should look like before we start designing. Otherwise, we don't want to go in a direction that the client doesn't want to go. And the kind of like simplest way that we do that is sourcing inspiration from around the web and getting their reaction to it. The issue is that they're not responding to unique work, they're responding to work usually sourced from other people, although we sometimes do use inspiration from previous projects. And it's not about their brand. That's where the proof of concepts have proven to be really helpful, because it is about their brand. They're going to respond to something and say, yeah, I agree, this direction feels great, or actually no, if we went in this direction, it doesn't seem like it would be good. But we haven't invested like the full amount that it takes to design a whole homepage. We're just taking maybe 2 to 3 hours to design these proof of concepts that are small design moments. Like in the example here that we're looking at, this could maybe be like the header of a page, or it could be like a testimonial section, it could be a mobile menu, just these small design moments where we're starting to tease out the visual language. How does the typography work? What do the colors look like, and how do we use them? How are we laying things out in terms of composition? Just teasing out the visual language and giving them something they can respond to, but the stakes are so low because we've only invested a few hours into this, and we're not saying, hey, this should be the homepage for your website. We're just saying, hey, these are just some explorations that we've done that could inform what the homepage and the rest of the site looks like. All right, so let's turn our attention to the actual design that I'm working on here. I saw this image of a Porsche on Unsplash and immediately recognized its potential for website design. And I kind of want to go into why that is, because it's a very niche set of things that you're looking for when you're sourcing imagery for the web, as opposed to like, oh, if I wanted to hang an image of a Porsche, I frame it and put it in my home, I'm looking for certain things. But when it's for the web, it has to meet a totally different set of criteria that mainly has to do with its role or its function. It's less about the media being like the main subject or the main focal point, and it's more about how the imagery serves the purpose of the website and how it's a supporting character in the overall like flow or arc of that page. This image is almost perfectly broken in half between negative space and subject matter. So we have the top part of the image that's in shadow. And what's really nice about it is that it's not a pure black. We're still seeing some of that texture from, I guess it's the concrete that's there. And so that's adding to the like the texture of the overall site and the visual language. It's not just empty black pixels. But then we have a clear focal point with the beautiful like front hood of the Porsche coming into light. It's signaling that there's more content below the page, and we're just getting a tease of what the Porsche looks like, where further down the page maybe we could have more like beauty shots of the full car. So it just serves as a great hero for this because, again, we've got that nice balance between negative space and focal point. That's really the crux of what I look for in media, especially for heroes or sections where the image is a background image, is it's gotta have enough negative space where content isn't gonna be fighting for legibility or even for prominence, but still has enough of a focal point that makes it an interesting image and something that you want to keep exploring. The next thing that I want to talk about is typography and how to use it to create a feeling. You know, it's very common to talk about color in that way. Like, we'll often look at color theory and the different emotions that color can spark in us, but we rarely talk about typography that way. But it can have the same effect in terms of creating a feeling around something. Here's what I mean. Let's take a look at the car. Now, I don't know if this is a modern Porsche, as in like it was manufactured this year, or if it's a vintage one. But even if it is modern, it has some vintage Porsche lines. And so it would be a mistake, I think, to lead with a sans serif or something like that that feels really contemporary, because it would be ignoring the lines in the Porsche. Instead, we want the type to feel like it's in the same universe or in the same world as the Porsche itself. So we want to choose a font that feels like it has a little bit of a vintage aesthetic. But the Porsche is also, of course, a luxury car. So we also want to choose a piece of type to use that also feels upscale and luxurious and sophisticated. I wish I could say that with time and experience, it becomes really easy to know which piece of typography you should use for every single project. But that just hasn't been the case in my experience, and I've been doing this for close to 11 years now. I think the key is to actually have the patience to futz with type. For any non-American members in the audience, futz just means to like constantly tweak and play with, to finally you get to the place where you feel like it's just right. So you'll definitely see me doing that in this video, where I'm kind of constantly tweaking the overline, the title, the logo even, or like the faux logo, and the thing that horsepower here is written in. I'm just constantly redoing that over and over and over again to kind of suss out what works and what feels right. So I think because we're trying to access how the typography makes us feel, it just takes a long time to kind of, anyways it does for me, to really figure out what's working correctly. And it's interesting because one piece of type will work in one project, and so you think like, oh, then that should work here too, but in another context that type just doesn't feel the same. So again, it's really just about trying to navigate to what feels like the exact right piece of typography for that project. I think what does get easier is knowing where to look. So over time, the more and more you do this, you'll start to have favorite type foundries where you know that the quality of the craftsmanship is there. And then you also have a sense for like which foundries are good for certain types of things. So a great example is like Pangram. I know that if I go there, it's going to be really bespoke typography that looks beautiful. If I go to Oh No Type Company, it'll be more like quirky and unique types of fonts. And so depending on the project, I'll kind of know, okay, this is where I should go. But even knowing that, I'll still have to kind of bring those in, like maybe download trials if those are available, and just try those different things to see if they work. That's how I began searching for the type for this project. Like for example, the title here, Le Mans Roadster, I knew that I wanted something, again, that felt really vintage, but at the same time sophisticated. And one of my favorite pieces of type that has that feeling is called MD Nichrome. I absolutely love it. I've tried it on lots of different projects. And here in particular, when I plugged it in, it felt like, okay, it's starting to lean in the direction that I want to go, but I feel like it's not quite there, because in terms of dials, like it's dialed perfectly in terms of vintageness. It feels like it has that vintage style, but it's not over the top. But I felt like I wanted something that felt maybe a touch more sophisticated, whereas this felt a bit too casual. Alright, so turning from typography, I think the next thing that I wanted to talk about was this divider device to separate the title content from the stats below it. I will confess that I don't know if the divider is a necessary element. It's very ornamental, but I like a lot of the things that it does in the design. So first of all, it lets me pull in a little bit of color, and overall I really like that the color palette is very restrained for this. So usually when you think about sophistication in design, that can often mean restraint. A restrained color palette, a restrained system of typography, restraint within composition. It doesn't always have to mean that, but that's often a great way to bring sophistication into your design. So I like that the palette is limited, but I do like that that little pop of color just adds some visual interest and draws your eye to the metrics below it. I also love that it's a subtle nod to performance. So a lot of times when you see like sports or auto brands, they have those right-leaning shapes because it feels like forward momentum. And I also like that with the color that I used, only having the pop of color on the last 4 of those skewed rectangles, or I don't know if you'd call them rhombuses. But that's kind of like a nod to speedometers and how when you get up towards the end, they have a different color and it feels like high performance and stuff like that. So I love that we're nodding to that. And then finally, I love that the rectangles are skewed and it's kind of pointing towards the angle of the shaft of light in this hero image. And once I move the screen up here, you'll see that it's not the exact same angle because the shaft of light, the angle is very extreme. And I don't think those rectangles would work quite as well if they were at that angle. But the fact that that angle is there just helps to tie the image into the overall design language. All right, so now we're entering kind of like the polishing phase of the design. I feel like for the most part, I've gotten the elements that I need on the screen. I've got my nav, my title content with the headline and the overline. I've got my ornamental divider that's introducing the metrics, and I have my CTA. So in terms of momentum, it feels like I've kind of like crested a hill and I can see the overall feeling that we get from this design. And now it's time to refine and polish both the individual elements and also the kind of general feeling or tone that you're getting from the design. So one of my favorite tweaks coming out of that polishing phase is what you're seeing me do now, change the typography used for the metrics. You might have seen that a little bit earlier in the video, I switched from using ND Nichrome to using a font called Canela for the title, the Le Mans Roadster. I love Canela because it's so angular and sharp, and it definitely gives you that feeling of sophistication. And you'll see that I actually switched away from Canela for the title because I felt like it brought in the sophistication, but it left out the vintageness. Again, it's all about futzing with the type to figure out what works. But I loved using it for the metrics, partly because I feel like it subverted a lot of the typical patterns that you see with performance. So I talked about, I'm messing with the divider here. Like I talked about, the usual pattern you see in like sports or the auto world is those kinds of shapes, and there's also those patterns with typography. So like usually for metrics you see a really bold, blocky, geometric font that feels large and powerful, and switching to an elegant serif with old style numbers where like the numbers kind of like dip below the rest of the line. It just kind of, again, subverts some of those things that you usually see. I like that it just feels differentiated. And I also like that we're bringing in the luxury from the car and the way that we talk about it. So we're not underscoring the power with like brute force. We're underscoring the power and the performance of the Porsche with this like beautiful, elegant serif. And there's just something about that that feels really right. Another thing that you'll see me constantly futzing and fiddling with is the spacing between elements. So you'll kind of see me re-evaluating, okay, how close should the title be to the overline? And how close should those two things be to the nav? And how close should the metrics be to the title content and the CTA to the edges of the screen? I'm like constantly reevaluating those relationships. And early on in my design career, in terms of my inner dialogue, I would get really exasperated with myself for fixating on those things and playing with them so much. Like, why can't you just let that go? Move on. But I think just like we talked about with the typography, there's a certain amount of patience that you have to have with yourself to really evolve things and make sure that they feel correct. So the UX principle that's guiding all of this thought process around the grouping of content is that things that are grouped together feel like they are aligned conceptually. So the closer that the metrics are to the title, the more it feels like those are one unit as opposed to two different things. And the same thing with the navigation. Like, the closer the title content is to the navigation, the more they feel conceptually aligned. So I need some white space to distinguish between the content of the page and the nav. And then with the metrics, it kind of feels like I want them to feel related to the title content. Like, hey, these metrics are about the Le Mans Roadster, but I also wanted to give it a little bit of distance so it feels like there's a visual breath or a visual pause between those two things, so that your eye is taking in the title in one beat and taking in the metrics in a separate beat. Speaking of fiddling with things too much, you can see that I am once again fiddling with the font for the title, but gladly this second artboard that we're looking at had the font that I felt like was the perfect match for this project. When I selected the final typography for the title, it made me realize that what I liked about it, or maybe even what I had been looking for, was something that harkened back to the dawn of automobile racing. So I think even the like placeholder or faux name that I chose for this car, because I had no idea like what it's actually called, I went with the Le Mans Roadster. And I think I just had it in my mind, since I was looking for something vintage, something that felt like it was like standing on the shoulders of Porsche's past or automobile racing's past. So I started thinking through like, okay, what could I do to emphasize that idea a little bit more? But it's just like a small touch. It's just a small note across the overall design. So previously I had thought, okay, I've got all the elements on the board that I need, and then when I chose the type, I realized, okay, actually there's something missing. So you'll see me start to bring in this shield shape from the hood of the car. I don't know if it's called a hood ornament or something else, and then I don't quite know what to do with it. And that's when I realized that maybe instead of it just being like this small icon, it can be something that feels more like an emblem, or something that feels like a seal of approval from car history itself. So this moment here is one of my favorite things to do. This overline was previously typeset in MD Primer, and that was a leave behind from when I used MD Nichrome for the title. And I like to do that, like if I know I'm going to use a little bit more of an opinionated font, I try to find something that is a little more of like a workhorse, but by the same foundry. When I moved to Spezia for the title font that you see now, I realized that it's actually a very flexible family. So I chose to go with this really condensed feeling, again trying to bring in that idea of like old world European racing. But it also has this extended weight to it. And I love bringing in things that feel like they're bringing in some tension into the design. So the tension or the contrast between the overline and the title comes from the width of the weights that we're using. Again, the title is this very condensed version, and the overline uses a very extended one. It's the same font family, but the fact that we're using these different stresses of width brings in that visual attention that's really appealing and works so well. So anytime that you find a super family like that, experiment with using the different weights to your advantage. I really love working with badges like this. I think it's just so much fun, and it adds so much to the overall visual language because you're treating the type so differently. But you do have to vectorize the letters or outline them before you bring them into Figma. Otherwise, it'll come into Figma as a PNG as opposed to vectors. So one of my tips is to always put in Adobe Illustrator to wrap the letters around a perfect circle. And then when you copy, make sure that the circle is included in what you're copying so that when you paste into Figma, the frame that Figma creates around your encircled words, the frame is actually around the circle that you encased those words in. And then once the vectors are in Figma, if you don't want that outward circle, you can just delete it or hide it, but you still have the frame that Figma created. And then when you center things, you're centering it according to the frame as opposed to the vectors. That's going to ensure you that whatever you're centering is actually in the middle of those things, because if you're centering according to the vectorized letters, they don't make a perfect circle, and sometimes they're not in the correct spot, and so it'll look a little bit off. Anyways, just a very small tip for how to bring in those badges from Adobe Illustrator. Bringing in the badge felt like the final piece that was missing from this design. Again, I wanted something that felt like the history of car racing was endorsing this car, and there's something about badges and seals that feel like they're doing that. I also love in a moment here when I rotate the words around the heraldic shield, and that feels like it kind of finalizes it as it feeling like a true seal. All right, so that brings us to the final design. I think I mentioned this earlier, but again, it was about an hour and 15 minutes of design time that through some strategic cuts and displaying this at 2x, I was able to bring down to about 20 minutes. My premier hope in doing this is that talking through my rationale is helpful for you in some way in your own design practice. If it was, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you, and consider doing more of these types of videos. So thanks so much. I'll see you guys in the next one.